When I lived in Japan for 8 years, I got to witness firsthand how language literally shapes our reality. How the words we use, the construct of language, provides a parameter through which we interpret reality. The Japanese people have a unique language in the sense that often first-person pronouns are dropped or not used. They're implied but not explicitly used in a sentence. And it's quite common for a Japanese individual to refer to themselves in the third person, to even use their own name when referring to themselves in a sentence while speaking. And this is interesting because the Japanese psyche and the construct of the individual ego is quite different than the Western psyche and the way our own individual egos are constructed. That's not to say Japanese people don't have an ego. They absolutely have egos. They just have different parameters around what comprises that ego. And a lot of what comprises Japanese egotism has to do with belonging to a certain group and a group identity and all of that. And the individual identity often comes second. Now, this is not a general rule of thumb, of course. There's always exceptions, but it tends to be a common theme in Japanese society, which is why group dynamics are far superior there to group dynamics, especially when working towards a specific goal or objective, when compared to Western societies. And yet on the individual level, the expression of the individual emotional, psychic expression is more repressed, less developed in a general sense. But all this goes to say that language is clearly, or at least clearly to me, a huge determinant of how we see reality. And language is necessary because we need it in order to express to each other. We translate our awareness and the contents of our awareness, our thoughts, our emotions, our hopes, our dreams, our fears, our anxieties, into words, into sentences, subject, verb, object, and use that structure to communicate to others, so in a way that others will understand. So it's a symbolic form of translation. However, the problem lies when we use language to express to ourselves, which is a very common theme in human beings, that internal dialogue that is perpetually functioning in the human mind. What it is doing is it is constantly interpreting reality within the confines, within the construct of the limited language structures that are available to it. And the problem with that is that when you interpret reality back to yourself, then what you end up seeing as a result of that interpretation is very different than what you are perceiving in the first place. All right? So you're actually encountering reality twice. The first encounter is a perception of reality, without judgment, without interpretation, without any of that. But very soon after, so soon after that you're unable to detect it, happens in a split second, fraction of a second, because we're conditioned to do so, the interpretation comes into play. It's kind of like, think of it as watching a movie with subtitles, something that most people nowadays in the Netflix era will do. Like I personally, for example, I've gotten to the bad habit, and we'll call it a bad habit, of watching English films with the subtitles on. It began because back when my daughters were very young, and put them to sleep and terrified that they might wake up while we're trying to have some downtime at the end of the night after a hard day, we would put the volume on movies really low while they're falling asleep. And so we'd have the subtitles on. Well, after a while it became a habit, to the point where now all movies are watched with the subtitles on, even though we don't need it. And what ends up happening is I find myself listening obviously to the audio, but also reading the subtitles. In fact, my focus is, without realizing it, my focus is primarily on the subtitles and only secondarily on the audio. And that's kind of how our minds work. You've got what's happening, which is a film, and then you have the subtitle track, which is the words, the interpretation that the mind is giving. Now, if you've ever watched a badly subtitled film, especially those of you who speak foreign languages, I speak Hindi, for example, I speak a little bit of Japanese, and if I'm watching a Bollywood film, which rarely ever happens, but if I am, and my wife will obviously turn on the subtitles because she doesn't understand Hindi, and often I'll say to her, wait a second, that's not what they said at all. That's a horrible interpretation. That's completely misleading. What they really said was this. And she'll say, oh, okay, that makes more sense. I didn't understand what they meant by that particular subtitle. So if you think of the human mind as the subtitle creating machine, it's using language to constantly narrate what is actually happening. And not always just language, but image and sound and past memory and all of that. Associations, all of that put together becomes this overlay of interpretation all the time. Then what you are reliant upon is the fact that those subtitles are accurate. And unfortunately, they rarely ever are, because our brains are designed to interpret and filter out information and filter in and focus in only on that information in any particular scenario that it thinks is relevant based on its own past experiences. It's tuning everything else out, right? It's focusing on fear-based scenarios, threat-based scenarios, opportunities, all of that. It's programmed to do so. And if you've had a traumatic past or a painful past and suffering and all of that, which most people have, then their brains are kind of hardwired to look for that. And what they're tuning out is the quote-unquote unimportant stuff that's not threat-based, opportunity-based, all of that, but really is the substance of what life is all about. So one of the ways to counteract this is the whole spiritual thing of being present, open awareness, that meditative mindful state where you're not focusing on the thinking mind and all of that, and you're more present with primary awareness, the perception quality of it. So basically saying you're watching the film not without the subtitles, but you're trying to avoid reading the subtitles in a sense, which is of great value because that's your most direct connection a human brain can have to reality. We'll never have a completely direct connection to reality, but it's more direct than the interpretive layer we have. However, it's not necessarily always practical. No human brain can be trained to perpetually exist in a mindful state, no matter how much anybody tries. And so the other focus we also need to have is the interpretive layer and clarifying that interpretive layer. And that involves critical thinking. This is why both are always important. I always stress the importance of both, is that you cannot only approach this from a be mindful perspective, because it doesn't improve the quality of the subtitle creating machine, which is always going to be active. And you can't only focus on critical thinking because you don't have a reference point beyond a certain place to be able to clarify the subtitle creating machine. So the focus needs to be on both. And so critical thought, the constant investigation, the constant inquiry, the constant re-questioning of one's own basic assumptions about reality, our beliefs, our hidden prejudices, biases. It has to be a perpetual process because we are always creating new beliefs. We are always harboring new biases that we might not be aware of, while also placing the focus on perception, realizing that that interpretive machine can only ever work off old data. It can clarify it, but it cannot create new data. It cannot, it's like trying to use your own language to learn new vocabulary. You cannot. You have to open yourself up to the dictionary or books that will teach you new words. You can't just realize new words by yourself. Similarly, without an open experience, without an open awareness, to life and to the experiences of life, we have no way to really bring in new information at all. And that information may not be threat-based, it may not be opportunity-based, but often that is the most vital information out there. The hue of the sky, the eagles roosting on the top of trees. As I look around, I'm driving right now, but as I look around, my focus is on the road, but as I look around, I see a lumberyard with snow-covered logs. There's a coyote running across the field there. I'm not sure why, but perhaps there's a fresh kill or a dead carcass that it is able to smell. And all of this is happening in addition to me driving on the road and trying to anticipate threat-based scenarios and opportunities. So language is critical because it is the interpretive filter we use, and so clarifying language, enhancing it, and getting very critically clear on language is very important. And yet, we need to also understand that the layer of language is just an interpretation. What our brains tell us about reality is not reality at all. It's its version of reality. And reality can only be perceived. It cannot be understood.